Yeah, what's up, everybody? Welcome. I'm Drums J. Bellezza, and this is the Right Mindset talking about how to create a language. And this is video number 7, where we're going to talk about historical changes for authentic con languages. Because the truth of the matter is culture, evolution over time, influence, historical events, technology. Technology. What is a phone? Go back to the 1700s and be like, hey, do you have a charger for the phone? A what? A phone charger. It seems simple, but they'd be like, I don't know what any of that means. Even if you say a neutron or an electron, they'd be like, who? Anyway, so how do we show life and evolution to our languages? All right. But Thomas, why does evolution matter in language creation? Language that feels ancient and dynamic adds depth to your world building. Remember, everything you do should influence plot, character development, and world building. Language is going to be one of those tools to allow you to move a plot forward by the way they speak, build character by what and why they choose to say what they say and don't say, and then, of course, build your world through the terminology and other elements. For example, as something as simple as "I am here with a message from the king" is world building. You have kings in your world. I am here with a message from the now you have that rule the land. All right. So that's how powerful language can be. Now, real language and all languages have been shaped by not only their speakers, the people, their communities, but the history that has adapted to new needs and circumstances. Okay, circumcision is a made-up word that was created for a very specific reason. All right. So you want your language, your con language, to mimic these natural evolutions. So when you're creating a linguistic diversity that reflects different regions or social groups, it'll help add true realism. And we're all about truth here. We want everything to feel truthful. And it will enrich, I promise you, when you start seeding little clues on the greater world and its evolution. Key elements of cultural evolution: language families and common ancestors. Language families and common ancestors, because that's the way it is. Now, for me, I have a language. So originally, it was just called Valus, and I was like, I don't want to name it after the base name for the species, because the Valus are like one of the most common species. I don't call them races because they are literally their own species. Um, because their elves are a species, Valus are a species, the Akids are a species, the Homerian are a species. Anyway, so Valus, there's Chem, Amy Liu's, right? There's different variations of a Chem, of a Valus, right? So I was like, let me create the name for the language. But I have common Valus and I have high Valus. So I call common Valus Edorum, and then I call high Valus Verdorum. Okay. Um, and that's a part of the process of creating language families. Is Adorum is a little bit more casual because over time they shorten the words, because the original dialect had longer words and a little bit more complication to it, and that remains true for magic. When using magic, you speak Verdorum, but like all languages, it simplifies. We think English is really hard, but imagine you spoke English from 300 or 400 years ago. You'd be like, I don't even know what they're saying. And I'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. Because you wouldn't. How would you know what they're saying? They're not using the same words, Anyway. Uh and the reality of it is most real languages belong to language families, groups, and other related languages. If you don't believe me, Latin, Italian, Spanish, love languages. Grazie, Italiano. Gracias, Español, and then Gracie, Latin, Latinus. Okay, those all mean grace, which in English means thank you. So it's loosely translated to thank you. All right. Um, but C K C K ita, which is Latin for yes. Uh, um, we, right? Yes, 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 yes. Okay, languages change. But they all come from a common ancestor, um, which is interesting because English is dramatic. So nine means no, right? Da, right? But that turned into yes. Like how did that work out, right? But guten Nacht, right? Good night. Guten Tag, good day. All right. Gesundheit, God bless me. Okay. So sprechen Sie Deutsch? Sprechen Sie is speak. Deutsch because it's Deutschland. German is Deutschland. So there are groupings of languages, and then there's like derivatives of those languages, right? So all languages have a connecting family, and then you could have these sub languages too. So when you're thinking of your language, like I did, Adorum and Verdorum, you create. I like to do the older language first, obviously, and then I adjust it based on the rules that were established for the old language. But we cut things out. We cut some syllables out, things like that. The short form, newer newer languages or sub languages from those also are influenced by it. For example, Elven, right? The elves in my world, I don't really like elves, but I put in my world because I was like, I don't like elves, so I want to be able to play with them in a way where I'm like, they aren't, the perfect things, perfect species. But anyway, elves believe they were the first, and Valus were the actual first, and so they have like that bias towards each other. Anyway, elves actually speak a form of Valus, like Verdorum, uh, but they think Verdorum is based on their language. So I always thought that was funny. But that's world building, right? Anyway. And all that is saying is that you can create a very straight language where it's just this is the language I created. And then you could take that language and start playing with it from there as the base and start developing subsets to that language, creating a language tree. So, yeah. A very easy thing to do is, the dialect variations. For example, in the United States, you have North and South, right? So yeah, New Yorkers sound. I am a New Yorker, and when I let the accent come out, it's very different than if I was talking in the South. We have a different dialect. We have different choices of words. Okay. Um, but dialects arise when groups of speakers become geographically or socially isolated. Dialects can differ in pronunciation, vocabulary, and also grammar. Um, so, what does this do, though? Right? It allows you to not only change the way words are said, but the inflections, etc. I do this with so adorum in Nordragas has a very specific way it's spoken. Obviously, you can't portray that on the page, so I do it through dialect. However, uh, everyone in Nordragas, they all speak with that accent. So when I have people in other countries or in other continents or wherever, and they're like say Sudragas or Nudiri, right? People will be like, "Oh, you must be from Nordragas," and they're like, "Why?" It's like, "Oh, because the way you say your A's, or your vowels are so airy, whatever." And that's a way of showing that there is a dialect difference. That you're playing with your T's a little too much. Your thurs are not strong. There's a moment in the beginning of the first book, not the very beginning, but Act One, where someone is teaching someone uh, Oldevna, right, the language of the trolls, and they talk about like, yeah, in Valus it'd be this way, but it's a little it's a little stronger and harder. Like it's a harder language, not hard to learn, but a harder language, like "Arr," and so it's more firm, and they explain that in the language lesson, which turns into a character growth moment. Oh yeah! So dialect is a really great way to play with your language in general, and it creates regional elements. Now, even in Nodragas, Tuwani is the language of the plains, right? For the Hamarans, it's a Hamaran language, right? And the Hamarans are their own species. Okay, so Tuwani doesn't sound like Valus or Adoram, I should say, but Tuwani sounds different from the different areas of plains. So there's people who live in Nodragas. There is a desert continent, desert area, and they speak very differently than the people from the northern area and different than the southern area. And then there's like this like northwest area, and they sound different too, from like people from Dark Ice, right? Dark Ice is a city slash region up there. Not that you know, because it's all made up anyway, and you'd have to read the books to get into it. But what I did was I made sure that I allowed the different regions to influence the way people speak to one another and the way they communicate and their respect for one another. And by respect, I mean like the hierarchy of things. Like some people don't acknowledge kings. So when someone's like, "I'm a king," they're like, "All right, Bob." You know what I'm saying? Like what does that even mean? Like you should be giving me respect because I have the highest status here, and you're just a king. And they're like, "But I am a king. I own half the continent." And they'd be like, "But you don't own this, so you're a nobody to me." And that's the reality of it. Also, historical changes. When you're looking at your cultural evolution, historical changes are a part of how language evolves over time due to uh, grammatical changes, the lexicon changes, added words. Again, what is a phone? And by understanding these changes and looking at your historical truths, so not only in the present evolution of history, so like what's happening now in your world or your stories, you can look at that and be like, how is this going to influence the language? And that could be an interesting play, right? Not that you have to go deep into it, not that it has to be narratively relevant, but it adds to the world. All right. But you could also look at what is the past. And maybe there's generational misinterpretations. Somebody who's let's say you have really old living people, like 600-700 years old, and they come from a time where certain, like, what is a phone, right? But meanwhile, I'm here and I'm in my 40s, but I know what a phone is. So I'm talking to them and they're like, what is a phone? And then you have to show them, right? Oh, I had to show my grandfather how to fix the clock on the VCR. The what? Yeah, there used to be this thing called a VCR, and you'd put these tapes in there, right? These VHSs, and you put it in there, and it would play the film. And if you watch Titanic, you had to have two of them because you had to take it out. Didn't just play through. No, we didn't have streaming. But some of the things you could think about with historical changes is everything from sound. The sound of words change. The grammar changes from maybe more like I talked about Adorum to Verdorum to Adorum. It went from a more complex style of language to a simplified language. So that is a grammar element. Borrowed words. So again, if you have different regions, those regions could borrow different words from each other. And of course, what does that mean? Well, in English, we had the great vowel shift that dramatically changed vowel pronunciation, right? Um, you know, uh, if you ever have a chance, listen to people who speak older languages, like on YouTube or something like that, where they'll show a language use and you'll see like I'm not saying anything real, but it's like that's the way it sounds and feels as Uthrama hriam, and it's like this beautiful like movement in the back of the neck. And now we don't do that. We are more like, how are you? Right? Cat, apple, right? But like even like, wagon. And then you listen to how they used to say words way back in the day, and it's just this beautiful kind of melodic I would say manipulation of sound in a just a gorgeous way. And it has simplified. And it's the same thing with language. We have the old English is much more complex than the new English, where there's a lot of rules we don't use. And of course, the borrowed language. We borrow from French to Latin to Norse. It's just what we do. All right, and yeah. So, all right, use history to shape the language. All right, conquest and empires. Conquered people will probably and most likely adapt to new languages of their rulers, could create a hybrid form. This is how Italia basically became a language. There was Latin, there was Spanish, there was Greek, there was Syrian, there was all these different variations of languages, Dramatic from the way up there. And they all basically formed into this amalgamation of different languages. So that's something to think about, right? If you have conquest or empires or kingdoms or whatever the case may be. Technological advances are also going to change words. What is a phone? All right. If you watch Arcania, oh, oh, the misery. All right. If you watch that show, they come up with magic, but it's a very specific kind of magic, and that creates a new word. And that's real time example of technological advances creating a lexicon, or adding, I should say, adding to the lexicon. So the invention of writing, or even the invention of printing, might standardize certain languages. It might slow its evolution. It might jump its evolution. Language might be able to be played with, because they're like, well, we could write it down and we could start creating consistent rules throughout the region, because we could go, this is what it is, and then books could be sent out. You know what I'm saying? Like, it changes the way we formulate language. And of course, cultural exchanges. Once trade expands, how deeply does your trade go in your worlds you create? How far out it goes? If you're writing in historical fiction and you're playing with America, this might not be that big of a deal. However, you still have to pay attention and do your research on the language of the time and the language of time, and the region itself. But if you're creating new worlds, sci-fi or otherwise, uh, who they trade with. If I'm going to be, even now in our real world, if I'm going to trade with, say, Italy, I would have to learn Italian just in case when I go over to Italy or Sicily or anywhere, Napoli or, Belize, wherever, and they don't speak English, because there's a very good chance they barely speak English or not at all. And that's okay, because they're from Italy and they don't need to know English. But if I'm going to do trade with them, and I have the agency to create trade, I need to know that language. So you have to look at your stories the same way. Who knows what language? Maybe they don't know the full language. They just know words in the language. So that's important. Also, migration. Obviously, movement of cultures coming into other areas, other regions, is going to help either develop or alter languages. When I was 12 to 16, I worked in a pizzeria, and I worked with my boss was from Sicily. His son was from America. Okay, but he was also Sicilian. There was a guy from Mexico and a guy from Venezuela. There was also a Peruvian guy. And all right. So the boss, who was much older than all of us, he spoke a dialect of Italian, which was Sicilian, which is not the Italian I learned in school, but it is the Italian I learned at home and from my grandparents. And then but it also was a different slang of Italian, because it was a very specific part of Sicily. Then the son spoke like an Italian that was sort of like Americanized, if that makes sense, but it was still Sicilian American. And then the Mexicanos spoke Spanish, but their Spanish was different than Venezuelan Spanish, which was different than Peruvian Spanish. But we all kind of talked to each other, and then we created, not purposefully, but we ended up finding a way to communicate, and that just evolved naturally over those 4 years. When I took Italian in school, they were like, "That's not how you say it," and I go, this is how Italian people talk at home." And they're like, "No," and I'm like, "Yes, we all understand each other, and some of them are from the homeland." You know? So, but that's all because of regions and trade. Anyway, final thoughts. A language evolves over time. It's going to happen. And if you pay attention to that evolution within your narrative and allow it to be something that's sort of humming underneath the overall narrative that you're creating, you will build on your world and give it life and truth. And when you think of your words, there's a chance that single word came from a sentence, a description of a specific thing, like maybe a mountain range was called. Oh yeah. Let me put this on the screen. Let me put this on the screen because I like this little example. Boop. All right. So when you're working on your story, you might come up with a mountain range that's called Card Den Mountain Peak, right? But over time in history, people might start calling people from that area Caratanes. They're Caratanes, which is a mixture of card, den, mountain, and peak, right? So it's Caratanes. Well, it's minus peak. It's a card, den, tanes. So mountains. So, they're the Caratanes, right? Or the Caucasians. They're from the Caucasus Mountains, right? So you can think about how to play with words. And if you have longer form names of areas, those names could turn into shorthand, which ultimately will create a new word, because over time we shorten things, we develop things. And that's a part of your journey when it comes to figuring out your language. All right. Next video in this series, we're going to talk about practical application. Whoop. Basically phrases and how to create storytelling. We're going to talk about greetings and common expressions and things to really settle into the con language. We're going to settle into the con language. Okay. Question. I asked this before. If these videos have been helping you with creating your language, please let me know in the comments below. If there are things that you would like me to expand on, or you wish I had gone over, let me know in the comments below. And because I am making a second season, a second 10 video series of this series, I will add it to the queue and get to it. If you haven't done so already and you love what you've been watching, please subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss out. Other than that, you all know. Keep developing the right mindset. I'll see you next time. Bye.